Hi, I'm Tina-Desiree Berg, and welcome to my special report on exit polling. The first exit poll on record in the United States occurred in 1967. CBS News commissioned Warren to do an exit poll on the Kentucky governor's race. Matoski then went on to do a national exit poll in 1972. In 1989, the major news organizations band together and formed a consortium in order to keep costs down. The name of that consortium was the Voter Research and Survey, and it conducted exit polling until 2003. In 2017, there was a split. The AP left and formed VoteCast, and Fox News followed suit. The remaining members joined together with Edison Research. So what exactly is an exit poll? Well, at base, it's an interview that's conducted outside of a precinct immediately after a voter votes. The idea here is to get an early sense of where the election is going. This is why news organizations have funded exit polls since the early 1970s. So here's where some controversy comes in. If you go to the Edison Research site or some of the other exit polls research sites and you look at their methodology pages, you will note that they say things like this. The exit poll results are adjusted to match the actual election outcomes. So that means that there are two factions when it comes to exit polling. The first faction, the news media, is looking to get predictive results. They want to know who won the election without having to wait for the vote tally. The second group wants to use exit polling as a check to election fraud. Obviously, these two groups have two different goals, and so sometimes can be at each other's throats. To cut through all of this, I decided to speak with some experts. The first expert I spoke to is Dr. Rodolfo Barragan. He did a Stanford study while he was a grad student there on election fraud and exit poll discrepancies. One of the things that Dr. Barragan mentioned in his Stanford research paper was that exit polls are used to detect potential fraud in other countries, but that ours aren't designed to accomplish that purpose. The reason is threefold. Number one, the exit polls conducted in other countries have much larger sample size. They have shorter questionnaires, which lead to a higher response rate. And because of this, there's a smaller margin of error. So I invited Dr. Rodolfo Barragan, who has a PhD in psychology from Stanford, to talk with us today about exit polling specifically. Welcome, Rodolfo.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. I actually want to pick your brain a little bit on polling because you have a PhD, you obviously study statistics, and I know you became involved in the exit polling controversies in 2016, 2017, so I thought you might be a good resource for this special report. So first of all, let's talk about what an exit poll is. It's basically interviewers going out to a site and interviewing voters immediately after they cast a vote, right?
That's exactly what it is. At least it's supposed to be that.
Yeah, supposed to be that. Okay, so mainly these have been financed in the past by news organizations, and here's where I think the controversy comes in. The news organizations is looking to do predictive results. They want to know who's winning the election before the votes have been tallied, because if they have to wait for the vote tally, they're sometimes waiting 1-2 days to get results. So the whole purpose of why they went after this market, why they created this market, was to be able to predict election results early on. So now the second group in this area are those that actually want to use exit polls to check against election fraud. And obviously these are two different ideologies, and they approach exit polling in a different way. So the tension lies in this, and tell me if you think this is right or wrong. The tension lies in the fact that because news organizations are using them to predict results, when they start getting election results in on the night of the election, they start tabulating the exit polls or sort of arbitraging the exit polls to the actual results. So you're going to see a change in those numbers from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., for example. The problem here is anyone that wants to use exit polling to check against election fraud would actually need to use the raw data to do so, because once those polls have been weighted against the actual election results, they can no longer be used viably for that method. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, and I mean, beyond that, I just think that these exit polls, as conducted in the United States specifically, they're essentially completely meaningless. There, you can look at many aspects to it, but they are meaningless, and they shouldn't be given really any credibility. And of course, the fact that they are off is itself its own controversial thing that we should examine, but that merely reflects the fact that the exit polls cannot be relied upon.
So why do you think they cannot be relied upon? What are your main reasons for making that claim?
Yeah, so the main organization that does this, so Edison Research,
right?
They are funded by these big conglomerates, the media companies, and but there is no scientific standard that can be very easily seen by everyone. It's not clear that a private corporation can be trusted with reporting anything of such value to themselves, right? They have a vested interest in the outcome of these elections, so it's unclear why they would provide the true, honest result, say in European countries, where publicly funded and publicly transparent research institutes, usually run out of universities, provide very thorough and transparent methodology.
Has anyone gone out and gone to the precincts that supportedly that these folks are doing interviews out and checked in on them? Like, that's a pretty broad claim, and I would imagine that it would be easy to decide whether that was true or not. Has anyone taken that project on?
There may have been a few citizen activists or citizen activists, journalists trying to take on that project, but of course that project, it would be very difficult for even a semi-well-funded organization to do it, because, you know, say you have to go all up and down California, all up and down Texas, etc., on the same day. So it's very hard for an organization that doesn't have all that many resources to do that. And even if you did have a lot of resources, you know, how are you going to ensure a representative sample in your exit poll calculations, in your exit poll methodology? It's not an easy task, even if you had a political scientist who was widely respected and transparent in their research doing it. It's a very difficult task. It's not like it can't be done, but I don't see any organization in the United States doing it, certainly not Edison Research.
So was this part of what you were discussing back in 2017 was related to Edison Research? Walk us through a little bit of what that is.
Yeah, so in 2016, there were a lot of citizen activists, oftentimes affiliated with, they wanted to make sure that their candidates were getting the votes that they deserved. So say in the example of Bernie Sanders, he had a small army of election integrity specialists, of which I would say that I fell in that category. And we clearly saw anomalies in the reporting of the exit polls and other kinds of polls. So for example, on election night, say it's 5 p.m. and Georgia doesn't close till 8, well, already CNN is reporting what Georgia's African-American women, white men, etc., how they're voting. It's very interesting that oftentimes the numbers you hardly ever see in that year. You hardly ever saw things like, say, 47% or 37%. You always saw like 40%, 80%, which could lead one to believe that it was a fairly small number of people, and it was an even number of people, if there were people at all. Again, we tried to contact the CNN director of polling, not just me and my close research team that we were working on that project at that point, but many other people tried to do that.
And this was at Stanford? Separately?
There was a worldwide team of election integrity specialists trying to draw attention to the fact that it seemed that Bernie Sanders was getting more votes in states that use paper ballots, and way less so in states that didn't. And then that held even once you controlled for demographics, education, even political orientation. And even if you did the analyses within a state, there were just anomalies in the reported results. And then a whole other component of that is how off the exit polls are. If any other country, right, was to do was to show these results, then it would trigger an audit, and the United States would be saying that those elections are illegitimate. And so would many other of the U.S. allies, and they would be pushing for an intervention. That would be if the numbers that, if the exit polls were actually less off than they are in the United States.
Okay, so just for clarification, the claim that you're making is that the folks at Edison Research aren't actually doing the thorough exit polling that they're claiming to do. Am I understand?
Yes, I haven't seen any evidence that they're doing any research at all.
All right. So let me ask you this. I did try to get my hands on the raw data from associates that I have at various news organizations, and the response that I got from pretty much all of them was like, that's not going to happen. That data is locked under quarantine, and the only folks that see it are those that are involved in the modeling process, during the day of the election. So, that's kind of shocking for me to hear, because I always trusted that was at least going on. I mean, I wouldn't know one way or the other. I haven't seen evidence either way. I'll look into it. But my beef was this, is if you want to use the exit polling to check on election fraud, it needs to be accurate and it needs to be the raw data, because the minute you start calibrating it towards the results, it's muddied in with those results. Although that might make the prediction more accurate, and I can understand why news organizations would do that, it doesn't serve the purpose if you're looking into election fraud. So it seems to me that the right thing to do at this point is, if we wanted to really have a project that was geared towards checking elections, it's time for academia or some of the universities to step in and really create an exit poll designed for that. And here's the thing, it's expensive. And you know this from being a statistician. You need a large enough sample size for it to be effective. And if you're going to do a national election like a presidential primary, you're going to need to look at a sample size that's easily 50K or above. For example, if you're doing an exit poll in the state of California, I would say you would have to have 3 or 4 interviewers at least 150 precincts to get a decent amount of sampling. So let me ask you this. I did make some inquiries into some of the pollsters at various organizations. And when I asked them what they were doing in response to this statement that they are calibrating or adjusting the results to the vote, what a lot of them told me was that they were doing that for demographics, which didn't make sense to me. And let me tell you why. And I'm mainly going to explain this why, so the audience understands what my thinking is, because I know you I already know you probably figure out where I'm going with this. You wouldn't need the voting results in order to do that. If you want to take your sample population, which is your exit poll, and you want to calibrate it for the correct demographics in the population, all you need to know is the demographics of the population. That's the first part. So, for example, say your exit poll only spoke to 2% African Americans, but the actual population is 8%. I would understand wanting to weight that 2% to bring it up to the 8% to have a more accurate reflection of the population. That makes sense to me, right? So, but the part 2 of this is you can't do that with actual votes, because nobody knows. When you go into a polling site and you cast your vote, that is simply you casting a vote. Nobody knows what your gender is, what your race is, what your education background is. None of that. There's no way to identify that data from just looking at votes. Right? These are just numbers. These are people. This is what voted. It's attached to whatever the voter ballot number is, right? There's no way to know what the race or gender of that person is. So this doesn't make sense. The only real way to know or make those claims is through exit polls and the questions that are being asked by the pollsters, right? So
yes.
Let me ask you, so why is it so predominant in the polling industry that nobody has questioned that response in regards to exit polling?
Well, the polling industry is simply a department of the media empire that the corporations have set up in the United States, and that media empire even goes to produce the content of that media empire. So the voting machines that we vote on and look and scan our votes, that's also a private corporation.
Yeah,
That
it's proprietary software.
Yes, exactly. So that's a
So
black box. And then what comes out is a black box. It's just a way of creating the perception that that there is an exit poll. It's very dicey to believe that there's true exit polling in the United States.
So the skeptic in me acknowledges what you're saying, that it is the case probably that any number of things can be going on and we would have no way of knowing it. So even if that's not the case, even if this is on the up and up, and even if they are actually sending people out there asking these questions, they're not playing fast and loose with the data, they should at least understand that the optics here are very bad, and there's a reason that conspiracy theories kind of come out through this is because they're not disclosing the data and they're not being upfront about their methods or what they're doing. And I think that is part of the problem. What do you think is a good solution to this then? I don't think we're going to get these news organizations that are investing all kinds of money into the system to disclose their data. It's not in their interest to do so. So do you think the solution is what I mentioned, to get academia involved and to start doing our own separate exit polling?
Well, it would be great to do that. I mean, anyone will face huge challenges simply because, I mean, you mentioned the number of researchers that would be needed to pull off even just one state's accurate exit poll. And the European countries invest in that. We unfortunately have not. So that could have been a job for high schoolers or college taking research methods classes. But we are. Yes, greater transparency can definitely come from more scientists being involved in that research, which is simply, it's not an area in political science, examining exit polls. It's simply,
it's not,
and, it's simply been ignored, or for some reason, scientists haven't really been studying it. But clearly they should, given that the numbers do not line up. And it's similar to, say, when corporations mess up and they pollute our water, for example, we go investigate and demand greater transparency, right? So here, they're messing up numbers that are very consequential for our lives in elections. So we should go investigate and demand transparency. If they can't provide it, yes, we do need to figure out a way to provide it ourselves.
Indeed. Let me ask you about a margin of error for a moment. I was always taught when I was in college that you didn't want a margin of error plus or minus more than 3%. Like that was a really good spot to be in, at that plus minus 3%. And you look at a lot of the polling data, and it's much beyond that. It's nowhere near the 3%. Does that raise red flags to you? To me, that tells me that the sample size is too small and a host of other things. I don't know that I don't know why why, if they're going to spend all that money, I guess what I'm saying, if they're going to spend all that money to begin with, why not increase the sample size? Why not poll more people to get a more accurate reflection?
Exactly. I mean, these are corporations that have unlimited resources. So they're extremely, apparently, small sample size, both for pre-election polling and the exit polls. It's unacceptable. So it could come from maybe they're not properly informed, or they simply, if they are properly informed about research methods, they just don't care.
So can you talk a little bit about what that means? So for a novice that has only seen the words margin of error, can you explain to them what the margin of error is and what the plus and minus 3, plus or minus 5% actually means, like in simple layman terms?
Sure. So anytime, say, you fill out a survey, say a 1 to 5 scale survey, right? So most people say maybe they'll be around a 3 or a 4, depending on the question. So when you talk about an error term, a margin of error, so that's kind of the error, the dispersion of the data. This how many people are on the lower side of the average, on the upper side. So there's a central tendency of the data. The data goes around an average, a mean, what they call it. So that would be for one question. For another question, like if you ask a Biden supporter, how much do you like Bernie Sanders? Well, they'll be kind of low on that. So maybe they'll be like a 1 or 2. So there's always going to be a mean value and error around that. The error is the measure of how much, given what given all the people who filled out your survey, how much do you kind of think that a new data point, like someone saying a 5, are they in the grand scale of the mean of your data? Are they in the middle, or are they way off? So when we say that something is, like more than say a 3 standard deviations, that would be the way that sometimes it's described. That it would mean that data point is way out there. It's way lower or way higher than what we expect.
Right.
So in the case of the exit polls, yes, they're way off from what they're expected to be.
Next, I spoke with veteran pollster John Zogby. And talk about exit polling, since this seems to be an area that's not only confusing for a lot of folks, but also kind of spawning some conspiracy theories. And I think there's valid reasons to not trust exit polling. But I want to know what your take is on exit polls. Are they accurate?
Well, first of all, the purpose of exit polling is very important for our business, because to me, the most important element of exit polling is not the predictive tool, but the demographics that it brings out. Who voted, how they voted, and why they voted the way they did. That tells us an awful lot. And it also gives us a good idea on how to apply weights to our next voter sample.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the important part. In terms of the predictive tool, there was a time when you could not only go to the bank with exit poll results, you could go to the bank at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and know who won the election. That's how good and accurate they were.
Wow.
But needless to say, things have changed, just like they changed on the telephone. And so now you had a real serious breakdown in exit polls in 2004. For starters. Turns out there was an overrepresentation of rural precincts, which was inaccurate. And secondly, there were numerous instances where the exit polling companies were not able to get people to work at the polls. And so they would hire down a bit. And you'd have situations where, and these were well reported at the time after the 2004 elections, that the person assigned was supposed to interview every 7th person, and the 7th person would come by, and it'd be a young mom wheeling a stroller, and the person would actually say, "Oh, I didn't want to bother her. Oh, here's a guy. Let me take him." Well, there's your randomness taken away. The biggest problem, however, with the exit polls is that a growing number of folks actually vote before the election day.
Yeah.
And so now you're not capturing those people on election day unless what you're doing simultaneously is not only catching them as they're leaving the polling booth, but also you're on the telephone. And you're asking people and you're who they voted for, and you're blending the samples.
Right. So my understanding is that Edison Research is actually doing that. They're taking a phone survey the week before the election to sort of qualify for the mail-in ballots, the absentee ballots, the early voting. I don't know. But here's the thing. They're not very transparent about that. So we're not really sure how they're going about that, what the extent of it is, how much consideration that's being given in the final numbers. So none of this is being done very transparently, which I think is part of the problem. And it seems to me that there are 2 different camps in this area. The first camp is the news organizations that you're talking, the consortiums, right? Whether it's VoteCast or Edison Research. These are all the major news organizations. Their sole reason for funding exit polling is because they want to be able to predict the winners without waiting for a vote tally. That's why they do what they do, right? And it's also why you'll see on voting day 0% precincts reporting votes, but they're already telling you who's won, right, based on that exit polling. But the second group is the folks that are more academic and they want to use exit polling to sort of check against election fraud, as they have done in Europe and other countries, in South America, et cetera. And obviously the intents and purposes here are very different. The motivations are very different, and how you would design the poll would look differently for those two different situations. And right now, I don't think either one of those things is being done well, accurately, or transparently.
And I'm going to argue that while it can be done more transparently, I don't think it could be more accurate. Remember, no matter how large the sample you're using in an exit poll or a telephone poll, it's still sampling. Which means it has a margin of sampling error that is based on statistical probability, and then there are other sources of error as well. Anything from the intonation of the voice on the telephone to the person holding the laptop computer outside the polling booth. And so you have an imperfect methodology. Now, look, when you get to the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine, and on one hand you see years ago the incumbent winning by 11 points, and the exit poll is showing that the opposition won by 11 points. Okay, let's say made you look. But if you take the national U.S. presidential elections of in this century, you know, the Gore election, the Kerry election, you know, even 2016 with Trump and Hillary Clinton, you're really getting into dangerous waters. You should not be relying on an exit poll to tell you who won.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's talk about 2004 for a second, because I think this is sort of a good point, historical point to look at as far as when things start to get, you know, awry. So in 2004, not only did the regular polling show Kerry as going to be the winner, so did the exit polling. Now, granted, most of the polling, I think, had both candidates, Bush and Kerry, within a margin of error, right? So if you're
well within a margin of error.
We're not sure who's going to win here, right? So that doesn't mean any of these polls are inaccurate if you're in that within that percentage space. Having said that, though, it was interesting to me the way things went down in Florida, because Florida is a prime example, I think, of where perhaps maybe exit polling could have been used to counter fraud. Now, whether fraud happened or not, minus the hanging chads, right? SCOTUS stepped in and pretty much put an end to the recount and declared the winner. But this is the sort of situation that's been transpiring in the United States that's sort of birthing all the conspiracy theory. I don't think people trust the system. I don't think they've trusted the system from 2004 forward. So any little thing is sort of like paving the way for people to not trust the system, or to trust the system even less than they already do. So what is your thought on that? How do we get that back?
That is, you know what, that comes through governance. And, you know, that you have to have faith that the person that ultimately assumes office is then trustworthy. And we found that out to be the case certainly during the Obama years, much more so than the George W. Bush and now the Donald Trump years. And the reason I say that is not so much to just, you know, shrug my shoulders, but to say that we're so hyperpolarized right now that we've gotten to the point where many of us not only don't trust the results of an election, and that's a growing number of people, but they're unwilling to recognize the legitimacy of who was elected, and that's a real threat to democracy.
I agree, and those things are related in a certain sense.
They are.
Do you think the exit polls were incorrect in 2004, or were they correct? Where did they start really going askew?
2004 was a disaster.
Yeah.
They were worse than most pre-election polls, and I was a victim of that one myself, because I released the exit polls to validate what I thought was going to happen. Personally, I had George W. Bush leading John Kerry, but only 45% thought that he deserved to be reelected. That's where I thought Kerry was going to win, even though Bush was leading. But the exit polls came out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Kerry was leading by 17 percentage points in Pennsylvania, 7 in Ohio. He was leading in Florida by multiple points. He was leading in Virginia, none of which was true. And those go back to some of the points that I made earlier about the wrong choice of precincts. And incidentally, I misspoke. I said there were too many rural precincts. There were too many suburban precincts, and urban precincts, hence a Democratic inflation there. And I have also worked for post-election, actually day of and day after election, for groups that wanted to use my polling as either a validator or invalidator of actual election results. I alerted them to the fact we can do the poll, but we're going to have a sampling error.
Okay.
And you can go to the bank with the results that we give within the margin of sampling error, 95 cases out of 100. So there's additional room for error, but you just can't use them to support an election.
So let me ask you this then, John. In the case of 2004, if you had something that is 17%, that is way beyond the margin of error.
Way off.
To me, that would indicate election fraud. I mean, I could understand saying if you were in the margin of error, even up to 5%, 3%, 5%, 4%, but 17%?
I talked to the exit poll people.
Yeah.
We are not a gracious field. And so we didn't like each other. All right, let me put it that way. Unlike, say, Hollywood figures or lawyers, we don't love each other. But I remember they were always on my case. And so I called them. I said, when are you going to release your sample? And they said, well, we can't release our sample. We have clients. You should understand that. Well, there was a double standard there. But I mean, look, the exit poll in Pennsylvania didn't end up with a 17-point lead for Kerry. But at 1 o'clock in the afternoon with a 17-point lead, there was no way that was even close to being accurate. I don't want to throw your listeners off or your viewers off, but I've also learned different demographics show up at different times of day.
True.
Yeah. And so I've learned over the years, look at the early exit polls, but, take them with a grain of salt. When all is said and done, don't use them to predict elections under any circumstances.
Okay. Also, I would mention that at 1 o'clock in the afternoon is going to be different than 8 o'clock at night. That's absolutely the case. But let me ask you this. The results that they report, CNN, all the news organizations report, the difference between an 8 p.m. release of numbers, and I'm not talking about vote tallies, I'm talking about exit polls, versus the 10 o'clock is also different. The difference is this. The 8 o'clock is more of the raw data because they don't have vote tallies yet. But as the night progresses, they start to adjust the exit polls because they weight them to the actual vote tallies. This to me sounds like it's muddying the water. What is your thought on that?
It muddies the water is what it does. Right back at you. So this is complicated. We've always known that that's what takes place. You wait to the election result. And so that's not pure sampling, is it?
No, it's not. It becomes useless to me at this point. Now you're just playing a game, right?
Now you're playing a game. Let me also reflect on a similar problem that I have, and that is how the coverage is governed
Okay.
between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock. They've seen results of the exit polls.
Right.
And so listen next election. It's maybe very subtle, but someone is being treated as a winner.
Yeah.
Someone's being treated as a loser.
That's right.
And or we're posting these results, but remember, not all the votes have been tallied yet because whisper, we kind of saw what the exit poll looks like. It used to be much more egregious than that. Used to be much more. Can I give you an example?
Absolutely.
Okay. So 1992 in New Hampshire, I wasn't polling New Hampshire in 1992, but in the Republican primary, it was President Bush against Pat Buchanan. And I had learned after the fact that northern New Hampshire comes out to vote early. It's not, I'm not going to make a demographic bias here, but these are folks who have more time. Right. They'll come out 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, whatever. And so by the time CNN is on the air, 5, 6 o'clock, they're hinting there's a major embarrassment to President Bush.
Okay.
And this is a much closer race than anyone anticipated. I remember it vividly. And the first round of exit polls were showing President Bush at about 45 or so, and Pat Buchanan at about 39. Okay. Or 49, 39, something like that. The reality is that after 5, more moderate Republicans come out and vote. That's when the urban areas are, and that's pretty much how it is in a number of states. And by the end of the evening, President got like 64% and Buchanan 36%. Wow. But it was still spun and hung in the air as a major embarrassment to President Bush. And there are numerous cases of just that.
Yeah. Yeah. So your argument pretty much is that the exit polls are wrong and that we should be able to trust our vote system, right?
Much more so, yes. Look, are there shenanigans? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Election commissioners are political appointees.
Yes.
Secretaries of state who govern elections are political appointees. And
I think that's fair.
These things, a lot more sunshine is shed on these things when elections are close.
Oh, so, I agree. So I have what I've now kind of called the cheating margin of error, which basically is addressing what you're talking about. I don't think anybody's messing with the vote tallies. I do think that there are political things that happen that are a subtle form of voter suppression. I think one of those things, an obvious one, is long lines. If you have a 3-hour line and people can't stand in that line, that's a form of voter suppression. Yep. If you do it in areas where you want to suppress a certain demographic, it's going to affect the outcome, right? I think in California, example is provisional ballots, and now we have conditional ballots. Not all of those ballots are counted. That's just a fact of the matter. So that could also, like if you're looking at differences in between vote tallies and exit polls, those discarded provisional ballots are absolutely a explanatory factor, right? So yes. I think there are legitimate things that can support that.
Oh, absolutely. And look, I'll go back to a personal story. In 1980. I volunteered for the League of Women Voters.
Okay.
My job was to just go to one precinct and collect the data off the old machines. They used to have a lever, and then there was a tally. And so I was there at 9 p.m. They took the tallies. It was Carter versus Reagan.
Yeah.
And so they took the tally, and then everybody got up to leave, and one woman came out with a cardboard box with a lock on it. And she said, "No, wait, we can't go. We have these absentee ballots we're supposed to count.
Yeah.
And all the other women said, to hell with we've been here since 6 o'clock this morning. I'm going home.
Yikes.
So, yikes.
I'm going with yikes.
Yikes
so they
is a
left
good
them
word.
there? Oh, man.
No, they took them. They just didn't count them. That's all.
That's terrible. And I think that sort of stuff happens a lot. This is, to me, an argument as to why election workers should be paid and not volunteers. You know,
Yes.
This is a job. It's an important job. Let me ask you a question about a 2016 study that was done by a couple of students at Stanford University, where they did a deep dive look at the exit polling data between states that were using paper ballots and states that were not using paper ballots. What they found, interestingly enough, is that the states that have had a huge discrepancy between the exit polls and the actual vote tallies were the states that were not using paper ballots. The ones with the paper ballots were pretty on par. What do you think that's about?
Go to an ATM machine
This
sometime.
was the primary election, just to clarify, the primary election.
Look, from the most benign, go to an ATM machine sometime and have your finger be close and it registers.
Yeah.
That's one issue. But the whole other issue is the opportunities to hack. Frankly, Tina, this was a system that wasn't broke.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with paper ballots.
I agree.
Nothing wrong with those old levers. There was just nothing wrong with them.
Yeah.
And now to enter, to place all of this potential for hacking and misreadings, I think is tragic.
I do too.
No need for it.
I do too.
That's before we even get into who owns them.
Yeah, it's proprietary software. That was what I was just going to say. These are corporations and it's proprietary. I don't understand what our government is thinking doing this. I mean, even the optics alone will tell the public not to trust the system, right?
Even the optics alone. I mean, and then to think, and I'm not conspiratorial in any way, but that a 15-year-old Romanian kid can screw up a state's election, where it's a hell of a lot harder to do that when you're using paper ballots.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should 100% have paper ballots. That is my very strong opinion. But it was just interesting to me that that's where they were finding the discrepancies. So who knows what that's about, but interesting data. Let me ask you about AP's vote cast. So 2018, there was a separation point between the consortium that was with Edison Research and the AP. The AP left. Their reason is sort of on par with what you think. They were saying that traditional exit polling is just not trustworthy. It doesn't make sense. If you look at the number of folks that are now casting votes via mail-in ballot, absentee ballot, early voting, it's more than half the electorate. So it just doesn't make sense to be going to polls. And so they're doing stuff online, sort of like what you're doing. Do you think that that's the future here of exit polling?
Oh, it has to be. We've all had to change our methodology in some way. Some are stubborn traditionalists in the polling field. I mean, it's like my saying, hey, we've always used landline telephones.
Right.
Even though landline telephone penetration today is where it was in 1956.
Right.
I'm still going to use landline telephoning. It's always worked for me. Well, I don't know much about what or how AP does it, but it's certainly headed in the right direction.
Yeah, no, it makes sense for the reasons you're talking about. I want to walk you through an actual case study just to get your opinion on something. So recently, the Michigan primary, Democratic primary. So this is what is sort of driving some of the conspiracy theory, I think. So the first initial exit poll that came out was released at 9 p.m. It was on CNN. This is an Edison Research exit poll. It showed Biden at 52% and Sanders at 43%, right? So it turns out that the actual vote count ended up with Biden at 52.9%. So that's pretty on par. But Sanders came in at 36.4. That's an absolute epic failure. Now, where these differences were increased, where they were made up on, is very weird to me. It's Bloomberg. It was a category called Other, and it was Warren. So Biden didn't move, but Sanders did. What do you make of that? What would be some of the explanations for that?
Oh, it could be the question wording. It could be that a couple of the minor candidates still in the race had some people that voted for them at the end. I really can't
Yeah, I see what
speak
you're
to
saying.
that
Okay.
exactly.
Do you find it strange?
Not particularly.
Okay.
No, not necessarily. That thing can sort of happen. Yeah.
Okay. So, but it's examples like this that are driving people to say, what happened to these Sanders votes? Why is Biden the same? Why is you know what I'm saying? There's conversations that are happening
Sure.
around this,
No,
which
and
I
I
understand
understand
why.
that.
Yeah. So anyway, so let me ask you this: if you were going to give advice to somebody that is a statistical novice, meaning they don't understand all the terms that they see on these polls, but they do want to understand what they're reading and they want to have a more informed opinion on what they're reading, what are some pointers that you can give them?
Well, obvious points. Okay, some are repetitive. Number one, this is statistical sampling, but it's very important to get a methodology statement and to see what bases are being covered to ensure that it's random to the degree that it's even possible anymore. Probability, does everybody who voted have the same chance of being selected?
Right.
Number two, who was actually out in the field?
Yeah.
Collecting the data. Was there a call center? Was it a live call center? Thirdly, be wary. This is statistical sampling. There is not only room for a margin of sampling error, but also room for, in the best case, any poll, including an exit poll, will have a 95% confidence rate. We did the poll the same way 100 times, 95 cases out of 100, it would turn out the same within that margin of error. But I'm a veteran of having had a couple of those 5%ers. It happens. And so not necessarily the fault of a pollster, just sometimes you maybe draw a bad sample. Mm-hmm. But question seriously, and don't, if there's a bookie waiting down by the corner and you've got an exit poll in your hand, stay home.
It's a Dutch book.
Yeah, just wait for the actual results to come in.
So in conclusion, I think it's safe to say that exit polls should just be ignored. I don't think they've been historically accurate as far as being predictive of outcomes, even though they're still used consistently for that nature by the news organizations. And they certainly can't be used to check against election fraud when the news organizations are weighting them with the actual election results and not releasing the raw data. But having said that, I also think something else is quite obvious from my conversation with Dr. Berrigan and John Zogby, and that is this. In the areas where there seems to be very large discrepancies between the exit polling results and the actual vote, it's where they're using mechanical voting machines or touchscreens of some sort. Where there's paper ballots, they seem to be pretty on par. So maybe the election integrity experts are right when they talk about the fact that these voting machines, whether it's by intent or by they're just not working properly or whatever those explanations are, maybe they're right when they say we need to go back to 100% paper ballot system.